right. Let's see. Today, wanted to go through mostly what the notes call Topic 4. There is a Topic 3 set of notes, but I'm going to mostly skip it. I think we can do without it, and we have enough to cover that I'm going to only look at a couple of slides with you. So this is Topic 3. It's got some geometry in it, so thinking about vectors, thinking about distributions, multivariate distributions, and different ways of characterizing variation and variability. If you're interested in a little extra detail on that, check out the first chunk of Topic 3. What I want to do just briefly is the very last little section, which is an illustration of how to do some summary statistics using matrix operations. So things like a mean, a variance, a covariance. It's going to be useful to be able to calculate things like that in R using matrix and vector operations. It's a good skill to have generally. R very widely used in statistics, and it will be more pleasant to work with, quicker, like much faster computationally, the more calculation you can do using vector and matrix operations. So something that could be done with a for loop, like if we had a mean vector, and I wanted to compute what's the sample mean of variable 1, sample mean of variable 2, ... You could have a for loop that loops over the columns and just calls the mean function repeatedly. It's more efficient, makes better use of R's infrastructure to use one command to calculate the mean for all the columns simultaneously. So that type of thing can be done pretty easily in R if we know how to express the calculations using vector and matrix operations. So let's just look at this slide for a moment. Two common summary statistic calculations with a data set are a mean vector. Throughout this class and generally in statistics, it's statistical practice to refer to a population mean with a Greek symbol mu. So just so that we're on the same page, let me just give a little spiel here. Suppose we have a random variable, univariate for now, univariate random variable like annual income or BMI or something like that. And just for simplicity, let's suppose that it's normally distributed. The two parameters of a normal distribution are the mean and the standard deviation or the variance. We might observe a sample of data from this distribution. Suppose we randomly drew in individuals from this population. Here's a picture of the probability distribution. And what that reflects is the distribution of values for this variable in what's called the population. So in statistics, we typically have a population in mind that we're studying. That could be all teenage females in the US. Or it could be all 50-year-old or older smokers in China. It's a total collection of people, things, animals that we want to study and make statements about. In the population, there are unknown quantities called parameters. For example, we might want to know what's the average life expectancy of 50-year-old or older Chinese men who smoke a pack of cigarettes a day or more. The parameter of interest is the average life expectancy. And if we could go investigate or interview every single one of the people who are in that population, then we could just compute this quantity of interest and we would be done. We wouldn't need statistics. There's no uncertainty because we assayed the whole population. So example parameters would be a population mean, a population standard deviation, but it would also include anything else, median, interquartile range, anything. But because we generally don't have the ability, the luxury to characterize the entire population, we're stuck in statistics taking a sample. So if I can't go talk to the 900 million 50-plus Chinese men who smoke a cigarette or a pack of cigarettes a day, my alternative would be to take a random sample, a representative sample from that group, from that population. I might go sample 1,000 such people. For that data set, I can compute estimates of the parameters of interest. We call, if you take a data set, observations of a variable, and you compute something, some one-number summary, that's called a statistic. There's statistics as a field. Within statistics, we use the word statistic to indicate something that we compute for a sample. For example, a sample mean. Typical or convention is to use X with a bar on top for a sample mean, X bar. Or a sample standard deviation. Often we use S. Okay. So here we are back at the slides, and we have a data set. We have a multivariate data set with N rows, observations, individuals, people, things, animals. And then we have P columns, which represent our, for now, numeric variables. There is a P vector, mu, that is the population mean vector. And there's a P by P matrix, capital sigma, that is the population covariance matrix. Based on our data, we don't know what mu and sigma are. They're unknown parameters. You'd have to assay the entire population to get them. But based on our data, we can estimate them. So the estimate of mu would be X bar, a vector of P elements. And our estimate of sigma, capital sigma, would be a P by P estimated or sample covariance matrix. And we'll use capital S to indicate it. So in a multivariate setting, suppose we have an N by P matrix of observed numeric variables. We're going to compute X bar, the mean vector, and all this is the vector of sample means for each of the individual variables. And similarly, S, the sample variance covariance matrix, we'll write it this way. Instead of little sigmas, we'll use little s's. sample variances down the diagonal, sample covariances in the off diagonals. The way that we compute these, so for the population parameters, the vector mu is the expected value of any one p by 1 random vector that we're observing. What's the average p vector from this population? The parameter that is the covariance matrix, so this is p by 1 and this is p by p. The definition of a covariance matrix is the expected value of x minus the mean vector multiplied by x minus the mean vector transpose. So the way that we're going to estimate, just to be consistent, the way that we're going to estimate a mean and a covariance is sensible. We're going to take x bar, the p vector sample mean vector, and in place of an expected value, we're going to do an average, a sample average. So I'm going to say 1 divided by n times the sum of the observed p vectors. All the xi's are p vectors. And s is 1 over n minus 1. I'll comment on why it's not n in just a second. But basically an average, again, replacing the expected value. So sum from I equal 1 to n, xi minus the estimated mean, xi minus the estimated mean, transpose. When you learned about, in your STAT 101 class, maybe you remember that the way that we compute a sample variance is kind of an average squared difference between the data points and their mean. It's kind of an average because we divide by n minus 1 instead of n. And that's always a little mysterious why we do that. It has to do with degrees of freedom. It can be a geometric argument. There are geometric ways of visualizing why we need to divide by n minus 1 instead of n. For now, just take my word for it. The sample covariance matrix that we will generally use, the one that R will give you if you ask for a covariance matrix, divides by n minus 1. We'll revisit this in some slides coming up, but for now, just wanted to acknowledge why is there n minus 1 instead of n? There is a reason. All right, so the point of the slide that I'm talking around right now is these are going to be very common calculations with a multivariate data set. Compute the mean vector, compute the covariance, sample covariance matrix. So to compute the mean vector, like I said at the beginning, an easy way to do that, kind of brute force, would be to loop over all the columns. And for column 1, to compute the sample average. For column 2, compute the sample average. Just do that p times and put those into a vector. That's x bar. A slicker way to do it that takes advantage of vector and matrix operations is x bar equal to 1 over n times x times the vector 1. So this is n by p, and this is p by 1. So if you think about what that's doing, that's going like this. We have x11, x21. First column is the observations on variable 1. Second column, observations on variable 2, and so on. So the last row is the last observation for variable 1, and then variable 2, and variable p. So if I did this, and there's p ones, that's a p vector. So n by p, p by 1. Then doing matrix and vector operations, that gives us what we want. 1 over n, the sum of x, let's see, I actually want to go slightly different here. I need to revise this. So before I revise this, let's go look at the notes to make sure I get it right. I need to transpose. So x bar, the sample mean vector, is like I wrote, but instead of the way I had it, I need to transpose x. What I want to do is add up all the variables for all the observations for variable 1, and then separately add up for variable 2, and so on. So let me revise this. This needs to be a transpose, and then these need to change. So I need to transpose this. So this is p by n, and this is n by 1. And in the first column now, well, actually in the first row, we have the n observations for variable 1. It's just the n by p matrix that we started with transposed. So now, if you carry out this multiplication, you end up with what we want. Just to keep it short, I'll say x bar 1, x bar 2, x bar p. X bar 1 is the sample average of variable 1. So all that to say, if you want the mean vector, instead of doing the brute force for loop that I mentioned, you can just do this matrix operation. You say 1 over n times transpose of capital X, matrix multiplied by an n vector of 1s. And it turns out R and similar packages or similar programs will be much more efficient when you do vector and matrix operations than if you were to do for loops. R really doesn't like for loops, especially nested for loops. So to the extent that you can take your code and express it in matrix vector operations, it'll be much more efficient. It'll also be easier to read and more, I think, intuitive, if you can train your brain to think in terms of matrix and vector operations. So that's X bar. I won't go through the details of capital S. I'll let you stare at it for a little while. It takes a little bit of concentration to go through this. But there is an extension to what we just did that results in a matrix-based calculation of capital S. This is the expression. This capital I is the identity matrix, and these ones are vectors of ones, like we just used with X bar. So here again, you could go cell by cell and compute the sample variances and covariances in a brute force manner, or you could compute this with one line of code and get them all simultaneously, and it'll be much faster. Okay, that's all I wanted to show in topic 3. That'll be a little bit relevant as we look through R code together throughout the semester. So I'll be showing you scripts and example data analysis in R. And I use a fair amount of vector and matrix operations. So just be aware when you see the special multiplication, the percent, asterisk, percent, that's matrix operation, matrix multiplication. And chances are I'm using that because I'm expressing an operation or a calculation with matrix operations. All right. What I want to spend most of today on is topic 4. This is where your next homework will come from. Much of the classical methodology that is applicable to multivariate statistics, much of it is tied to a assumption, a distributional assumption, that your data came from a particular distribution. And just like in Stat 101, how you are kind of tied to the normal distribution, the univariate normal, some of the methods in multivariate are tied to the multivariate normal. So I'd like you to know the basics of multivariate normal. The idea is if X is a univariate random variable, normal with mean mu, standard deviation sigma, its distribution is the familiar bell-shaped curve. If instead, let's say we have a bivariate normal random vector, we can say X, the 2 vector, comes from the 2-dimensional normal with a mean vector mu and a covariance matrix capital sigma. So now instead of a 1-dimensional bell-shaped curve, we have 2 variables, and we have a mean and instead of one bell-shaped curve, we kind of have 2 bell-shaped curves that are continuously connected to each other. So it kind of looks like that. It's an elliptical surface centered at the mean vector. And whereas we compute probabilities from a univariate normal by integrating or computing the area under the curve between 2 numbers, in multiple dimensions, we're computing volumes. So for a region of x1 and a region of x2, let's compute the area under this multidimensional curve, or the volume. So that's what this topic this chapter is all about, is the multivariate normal. When we do multivariate t-tests, when we do multivariate regression, multivariate ANOVA, at least those, there's an assumption behind the scenes of normality, multivariate normality. So this set of notes is going to give us some of the basics of how to work with a multivariate normal. It'll also show us how to check whether our data are multivariate normal, because if you're considering using a statistical method, you need to be aware of what its assumptions are. If you use a method whose assumptions are not valid, then your results are potentially not valid. So we'll want to be able to check, does multivariate normality appear reasonable? And we'll also see a technique for, suppose your data are not multivariate normal, transforming the data to make them more closely multivariate normal. All right. Another important place where the normal distribution shows up in statistics is with what are called sampling distributions. We talked on the whiteboard just a second ago about there's populations with parameters and there's samples with statistics. So anything you compute from data is a statistic, like a sample mean, a sample standard deviation. Because your data are collected randomly, your statistics are random. They're random variables. If I were to go out and compute the average income of a random sample of 1,000 recent college grads in the US, I'd get an estimate of the population average annual income for that group. But it's just an estimate. If you went out and sampled your own 1,000 recent graduates, you'd get a slightly different average. And imagine if we all did it, we'd have a bunch of different averages. If we drew a picture of those, like a histogram, that distribution of the averages is called the sampling distribution of the statistic sample average. Sampling distributions are the distribution, the probability distribution for a sample statistic. And they are critical to the process of statistical inference. If I want a confidence interval for a parameter, or if I want a p-value for testing a hypothesis about the parameter, in order to do that, I have to have sampling distributions. So they're really critical things. And what's nice is that in many cases, the sampling distribution of a statistic has a known form, at least approximately. And in many cases, it's normal. If you know the sampling distribution for a statistic, you can get confidence intervals and p-values. And it's nice that many things like a sample average, if you have a large enough sample size in particular, the sampling distribution of an average is approximately normal. Similar things happen in multivariate statistics. Multivariate sample means are approximately normal. So all that to say, we care about the multivariate normal. All right. This is just a reminder of what I hope you already know. In the univariate case, here's the gory details about the normal distribution. The probability density function, the function that we compute areas under to get probabilities, is of this form. The mean is mu, the variance is sigma squared. We have these rules of thumb that are handy for kind of back of the envelope calculations that say if you go out one standard deviation from the mean. So if you look down here at this picture, here's the mean right in the middle, mu. And if you go out plus or minus one standard deviation, so mu plus one standard deviation right there, and then mu minus one standard deviation right there. So plus or minus 1 SD, the area under the curve is approximately 68%, 0.68. probability, a normal random variable gives you a value that's within 1 SD of its mean is about 68%, 0.68. If you go out 2 standard deviations, you get roughly 95%. And if you go out 3 standard deviations, you get almost all of it, 0.997. Here is the generalization to multivariate normal. You saw this, you've seen this in homework 1. If p is bigger than or equal to 2, then we have multivariate normal data. We have a mean vector mu and a covariance matrix sigma, which we need to have be positive definite. The reason we need it to be positive definite is because probabilities can't be negative. So I need this expression here to be well behaved. This is a quadratic form. It's something, a vector, times a matrix times a vector. Quadratic form or a distance. So sigma needs to be well behaved, positive definite. Here is a worked out example in the bivariate normal case. It's good to do this once in your life to think through kind of the gory details of what that matrix expression translates to in terms of univariate statistics. So if you just apply what you know from the previous slide to a two-dimensional problem, mu is mu1, mu2, the 2 vector. Sigma is a 2 by 2 matrix with sigma 1, 1, sigma 1, 2, sigma 2, 1, sigma 2, 2. And if you work that all through, you get this mess as the bivariate normal PDF. Notice from this expression, this is only bivariate, so this is 2 dimensions. Rho, the Greek letter rho, squiggly p, is generally used to refer to correlations. If I have 2 variables, I have 1 correlation, the correlation between variable 1 and variable 2. So if, first of all, let me ask you this. Suppose we have, come back here. Suppose we have x that is 2 by 1, so a bivariate random vector. The correlation, rho, is the covariance divided by the product of the standard deviations. If, okay, so suppose that rho equals 0. For normally distributed data, if the correlation is 0, what does that tell you? Does anybody know? They're independent, right? They're statistically independent. That means that our 2 random variables, independent, are not correlated. They're independent of each other. And what can I do? The probability distribution for a vector x, if x1 and x2 are independent, what math operation can I do to simplify? I can product, I can multiply. The probability that x1 equals little x1 and x2 equals little x2 is just the product of univariate normal with mean and variance times univariate normal. just leave it like that. So if you have independent random variables, then their distribution is just the product of their individual distributions. And the point I want to make back here is, suppose that in this case, with this mess in the middle of the screen, that they are uncorrelated. That means the rho variable is equal to 0. If rho is equal to 0, then this whole cross product term goes away. This constant just becomes minus 1/2. And this goes away as well. And it turns out, if you write that down, that is exactly the product of two univariate normals. So that's kind of a minor point, but I think it kind of helps to tie to what you already know, hopefully. Rho, in the bivariate case, is just the correlation between variable 1 and variable 2. If they are uncorrelated, then because we have normality here, that means they are independent. And for independent random variables, you can just multiply the univariate PDFs. Then I've got some pictures that show example multivariate normals. This is multivariate normal where the variances are the same. The variance of x1 and the variance of x2 are the same. When you have equal variances, the elliptical surface will be symmetric. If you have, for example, x1 I don't want to jump ahead that much yet. If you have x1 being more variable than x2, then you're going to have the elliptical surface kind of skew out along x1 and be more pinched along x2. So with equal variance, it's symmetric. And then in this particular case, not only are they equal variance, but they're independent. Rho is equal to 0. So this is like the baseline vanilla bivariate normal. That's what it looks like. And as you change the parameters, you get different shapes. For example, here is same variance still, but I've changed the correlation to be positive. So it went from being symmetric to being pinched and following the line of equality. As x1 changes, x2 is restricted to change to be close to x1 because they're positively correlated. And might as well go to R real quick. So under scripts on eCampus, then under topic specific, there's a topic 4.R. And I have code that reproduces the pictures that are in the slides. So for example, here is a function like you're doing in homework 1 to code up the multivariate normal PDF. Although I asked you in the homework not to use a special function. I think it's good practice at least once in your life to code it up manually. Once you've done that though, it's easier, you'll agree I think, to use a built-in function. So here is a built-in function, dmvnorm, to compute a PDF for the multivariate normal. FYI, in R, suppose we want to do normal-related calculations. Built into R are these functions. There's R norm, there's D norm, there's P norm, and there's Q norm. The norm indicates univariate normal distribution. The R indicates random draws from. So if I wanted to generate a sample of 100 observations from the normal distribution with mean 0 and variance 1, I would use R norm. If I wanted to compute the PDF, tell me what the height of the bell-shaped curve is at point 2. I would use D norm. If I wanted to compute cumulative probabilities, so integrals from negative infinity up to a particular number, cumulative, I would use the P norm. So P norm is like a CDF function, cumulative distribution function. And then Q norm is if you want a specific quantile, like give me the 95th percentile of this normal distribution. This is a generic framework in R, and there are related functions for the T distribution, the gamma, the beta, and many more. So for the T distribution, for example, there would be an RT, a DT, a PT, and a QT. For all the different distributions that are available to you, there are those 4 types of functions. So over here, there is a function called MV norm. It's located in a specialized package. I'll say something about that in a second. But once you have that package loaded in, you have access to a bunch of MV norm functions. And there's an R, a D, a P, and a Q. So here, this is going to compute the bivariate or the multivariate normal PDF. FYI also, when dealing with R comes to you pre-packaged with lots of goodies, lots of functions that'll do basic stuff. Draw a picture, compute means, do all types of things. One of the nice things about R, though, is that it's open source and kind of modular in design. So there are additional packages that are available for specialized operations. Like the MVT norm package is not available to you in R by default. So DMVT norm is not recognized. In order to access that function and everything like it, I need to go get the library that it came from. So there is a library on the internet called MVT norm. And if you want to access that, what you have to do in R is use the packages interface and install that package. So let me show you what that looks like real quick. I want MVT norm on this computer. I went to packages and then I selected install package. Then there's a bunch of places around the world where you can download from. Good practice is to pick one closest to you. So I'm going to pick Texas. Click OK, and then I get a list of the hundreds of packages that are available. So I'm going to go down to MVT norm. And click OK. A possible challenge for us, you, is permissions on your computer. So on this particular computer, it's telling me I'm going to go try to write these files that define the package to your hard drive in a predefined location, this location. I'm going to go try to put it at C, program files, R, current version of R/library. But I'm not logged in as an administrator on this computer. So it tells me it's not writable. hopefully on your computer, since you are hopefully administrator, you won't have this issue. On my laptop, I don't get this issue. Yeah.
So one thing I'd recommend is to check your firewall settings. I think that's what caused my problems. I got everything downloaded now, but
So you had this issue initially, right?
yeah.
On your personal laptop.
And your firewall settings can mess with the access levels that you get on your computer. So that if you're having trouble, that's a possible troubleshoot.
Okay. So if you have any trouble, like you will be installing some packages throughout the semester. If you have issues, put it on the discussion board, and we'll get it figured out. Okay. All right. So here is just some code that makes the pictures in the slides. FYI, if you're still working on your homework, I told you in the Q&A that you can create a partition of X and of Y. So this is like you're creating a grid. To use the perspective function, you need to create a grid over the region that you want to plot, and then compute the value of the function at each grid point. You can do that with brute force loops. A slick way to do it is the outer function. It's not necessary that you do it for the homework, but for future reference, you might want to check out the outer function. So in this case, X is a sequence that goes from -3 to 3 with a length of 50. And Y is the same thing. Those two things together define the grid that I'm going to plot over. Then the outer function, you give it the X grid point, grid values, and the Y grid values, and then you give it a function that you want to evaluate at every single grid point, and it does what you want. It'll give it back to me a 50 by 50 matrix that's F, in this case the multivariate normal, evaluated at every single combination. All right, looks like we're out of time. This slide is similar to a slide in topic 2 that I predict you have stared at for the homework that has to do with ellipses of constant distance away from the mean. This derives directly from that. So it's one of the probably least favorite slides for the whole class in topic 2 that talks about to get the ellipse of constant distance, you go in the direction of the eigenvectors, and the length is like 1 over the square root of the eigenvalue times the constant c. It's a mess. This comes directly from that. So you don't have to relearn anything messy. It's just an application of something you already saw. Yeah.
Would ambiguity norm package give a function for the univariate distributions also? Like R norm, P norm, P norm?
What about them?
So ambiguity norm package, would it give functions for the univariate distributions also?
No.
What is the library for?
The univariate distributions come with base R. Oops. So R norm, D norm, RT, all those things are there. The multivariate normal is a specialized thing. But all the univariate distributions are there. Okay, I will let you go. See you Wednesday. I will have a Q&A tonight, FYI. So that recording will be up either late tonight or early tomorrow.